This was a post that went up on Facebook on VE Day. It was part of my 30-day lockdown writing challenge. It was my father's favourite war story. There are moments in our lives that are constructed from just a handful of seconds, which birth tidal waves of change whose ripples span across our own existence and down through the generations. The count that I'm about to read to you probably doesn't cover any more than just a few minutes at the most, but proved to be one of the most significant moments of my father's life. He didn't talk much about the war, and I don't think that he mentioned this particular story until he was over 70. But from that point on, he was much more willing to open up about at least some of the experiences he had during that time. My father was in the Royal Horse Artillery. At this point in the war, he served out in Africa. And during his time out there, one of his regular duties was to drive an officer, I think a captain, out into the desert. They would head out and park up on a high dune to scope out the land and see what the German troops were up to. Most of the time, these were tedious and uneventful, but from time to time, he would be spotted and the Germans would give chase after them across the desert as they headed for safety. Each day as you set out, you never know what that day would hold. The story I'm going to relate to you is not one of those missions. On this particular occasion, he was driving in a convoy, though he didn't relate any more of the detail about the size of the group or the reason for their travel. Someone spotted a plane and the convoy stopped. Binoculars were trained on the sky. It was German, but perhaps it wouldn't see them and pass on. As it banked to circle round, it was clear that this was not the case. There was no point driving off and trying to outrun it. They would be easy targets. Men began to peel out of their vehicles, leaving the doors open, shouting to each other as they ran for cover. The problem is, in the desert, there isn't really any cover. The plane began its screaming dive. It was a Stuka. These planes were a type of bomber that would aim themselves at its target and go down into a fast dive. At the last moment, it would release its bombs before sharply pulling up. This meant its target accuracy was really high. It emitted a distinctive scream as it went down into its attack dive, which soon became dreaded by those who heard it, and for a great many, it was the last sound that they ever heard. As my father stood on the burning sand, running seemed fruitless. No one was that fast. He didn't consider it a heroic decision. It was just an instinct that I guess came out of who he was. But while everyone else around him was scrambling for safety, he stood and raised his gun to his shoulder. He didn't have anything fancy, just an infantry rifle, whatever was standard issue, and he began to fire. He said that he knew he couldn't bring the plane down with a rifle and would be lucky to hit it at all as it approached, but he stood his ground and he fired shot after shot. I don't know how many he actually managed to shoot off. He didn't say. War is often highly impersonal, with casting bullets or armaments at people that aren't even in sight or just distant blurry shapes on the horizon. But in this moment it was different, with one man facing another. The dive had now reached bomb jettison height. My father fired one last shot and suddenly the plane twisted out of its path. There was a brief sound of a bomb hurtling through the air, followed by an explosion as it detonated amongst the dunes. It fell too far away to do any damage to any personnel or vehicles. Instead of sweeping back round for a second run, as would be expected, the Stuka rose back up into the sky, turned, and flew off into the distance. What actually happened in the cockpit of that aircraft can't be known, but my father was pretty confident that he understood the motivation of the fellow soldier that he was facing. He believed that the German pilot found respect for this plucky little Tommy standing facing down certain death and just decided that he didn't want to take his life, not that day. And at the last moment, as the bomb was released, he reached this decision and turned the plane aside, letting the bomb fall wide. Even if this had been the last bomb he was carrying, he still had heavy machine guns that he could bring to bear on the convoy. But he didn't. There might be other explanations that could account for it. Maybe my father did have an extraordinarily lucky shot and hit the windscreen of the plane, and he involuntarily jerked off course instinctively. Maybe he was actually hit by the bullet and wounded and wanted to waste no time completing the attack, but felt the urgent need to get back to receive medical attention. Personally, I think that they are quite unlikely scenarios. Or maybe it is just that I prefer my father's explanation. But one thing is sure, that if my father had died to that Stuka bomb that day, my 2 brothers and I would not have been here. Neither would be the 8 children that we have brought into the world, and consequently our 13 grandchildren would neither have existed. And who's to say how many more generations to follow? All these ripples in history held in the few seconds of thought that ran through a German pilot's mind over 75 years ago.